Every now and then I build a project that seems to zap all my mojo, and placing the 10,000 something rectangles on the 688i seemed to do just that for me. I peered into the stash to see what I had that I could build in the background to keep my mojo going, and I grabbed this 1/35th scale Mark 45 Mod 4 from I Love Kit. If you've ever lost your scale modeling mojo, hit that like button. Let's get into the build. These 1/35th scale ship armaments, like this Mark 45 Mod 4 from I Love Kit and RPG Model's handful of CWIS offerings, have always caught my eye, and this one would be perfect to work on while I was waiting for things to dry on the sub. There's only a handful of parts in the kit, 12 or so it'll go together quickly without much headache. This is the first kit from I Love Kit I've built, and despite a few annoying ejector pin marks, which we'll cover in a second, it went together without much headache, which was just the thing I was looking for. One decal and 2 photo etch pieces were included in the kit, so really no headache at all. I started off by using some 400 grit sandpaper on a rigid back sanding stick, just to clean up the overall shell of the Mark 45. It wasn't necessary to do this all over, only really at the bottom of the shell, but I went over everything just to sharpen up the angles and have them looking nice and crisp. It was nice to see that the barrel for this had been slide molded and wouldn't require any awkward cleanup, just a minor parting line that was quickly sanded away. Like I said earlier, assembly on this was headache free and all the parts went together nice enough. There were a few hang-ups which I'll cover throughout the assembly process, but nothing that turned this build into anything other than the mojo booster that I intended it to be. The problems really stemmed from the pieces that formed the elevation mount for the cannon itself, these two pieces here. I almost wish that I Love Kit made this a 3-piece assembly so the seam could be hidden at the corners rather than having a seam right down the middle that had to be cleaned up, but no kit is perfect, and this was a very nice change of pace from assembly on the submarine. I always dry fit parts together out of habit just to make sure I don't need to do any cleanup to have them fitting properly. It only took me a handful of times to finally learn my lesson to not apply glue before I've checked part fit. And here's those unknowingly placed ejector pin marks I was talking about earlier. They're right where you're going to see them, so they need to be dealt with, and there's a total of 10 that need filling. It's nothing that to me is filler putty and a silicone clay shaping tool can't fix. I like using a silicone clay shaping tool for stuff like this because I feel like I've got more control than when I use a toothpick, plus the dry putty pops right off the clay shaping tool. And while the putty is drying, I'll address the fact that the kit doesn't include the anti-slip texture on the base of the Mark 45, it's just molded as smooth plastic. This is really an optional thing, but because I hadn't used VMS's anti-slip texture before and there was absolutely zero pressure to make this kit perfect, I went ahead and tried it out here. I'll place the few parts on the base that need to be here and mark them out so I can mask the inside of where it'll go. That way I don't get anti-slip texture where it shouldn't be, which is on the inner side of these shields, fairings, I'm not too sure what they're called. With the no-go zone masked off, applying the anti-slip texture is really as simple as brushing the glue on and then sprinkling the finely ground sand on top. You don't need to worry too much about laying the glue down perfectly, I found out, as it self-levels quite well. But it does lose its stickiness quite quickly after being applied, so it's best to work in small areas. This was intended for the anti-slip texture on armor, so that won't really be a concern if you're working panel by panel, but it's just something to keep in mind. I used an old brush to spread the glue just to be safe, although it washed right out with some paint thinner. Once the glue was laid down, I just poured the grit out from the bottle right onto the area where it needed to go. It didn't look like the grit soaked up the glue, so I wouldn't worry about applying too much, and in fact I found it better to apply more rather than less, as going back over areas that had a light coating proved to be a little tricky. Once you've let it sit for a few minutes, you can just tap the excess grit off, though I'd recommend doing this onto a piece of paper if you want to recoup the extra grit. Although I did the entire base and it didn't really make a dent in the bottle, so it's just personal preference. After cleaning up the excess putty from the ejector pin marks on the cannon's elevation mount, assembly can continue. I took care when gluing the sub-assembly together just to ensure that I could still adjust the elevation of the cannon. It doesn't require too much attention to be paid to it, but you also don't want to go hog wild with the glue because you can end up gluing the piece the barrel mounts to in place and you won't be able to adjust the elevation. The stout locator tabs were a nice touch, although like I mentioned earlier, with the seam being right down the middle, some more filler putty and sanding was required to hide the seam between the two halves. The two pieces of photo etch included in this kit are a nice touch, as you'd end up sanding away a handful of the rivets when you clean up the seam here, so why I Love Kit decided to do this instead of making the assembly 3 or 4 pieces and thus hiding the seam, negating the need for this photo etch, I don't know. Well, anyway, with all that fussing about done, I dropped the elevation mechanism into the body of the Mark 45 and get it glued up. The fit here isn't perfect and thus more filling and sanding is needed, but I'm not sure if that's an error between the chair and the cutting mat or due to some warpage on the outer shell. Once the elevation assembly is glued in place, I can add the bottom plate to the outer shell and finish up the main body of the Mark 45. Even though this kit is supposed to be something fun and fiddle-free, I enjoy scratch building, and there's a few missing boxes and cabling on this back panel here that you can see the 1-to-1 scale thing has in these reference photos. It's nothing some copper wire, styrene, and Deutsch connectors can't fix. If I was building this to be perfect, I'd probably fire up SolidWorks and make the boxes perfect scale representations, but I'm just here to have fun, so I cut some pieces of evergreen styrene and shaped them to be more or less the right shape, although they are a little on the large side. The Deutsch connectors get holes drilled into where they need to go and super glued in place. With that extra little bit of work done, the assembly of this kit is finally complete. I've just dry fit the barrel here as it'll be easier to paint as a separate piece, but I wanted to point out I also added the missing connector and wire to this box up on the barrel of the Mark 45, this little spot right here. The little bit of extra work was definitely worth it, as it really spruces up what is otherwise a very bland area on the back of this kit, and honestly, I'll never shy away from attempting to make some bits of plastic look more like the real thing. With the assembly done, it's time to start the painting process, and that means giving everything a coat of Tamiya Surface Primer. This is my go-to primer, as I really like the bite it has and I don't need to worry about subsequent painting layers coming off during masking or weathering. With the base primed, a coat of black paint from MRP will do double duty here, providing a black base for the pre-shading along with painting the sides of the base black. I'll then use a combination of haze gray and gunship gray, both from MRP, to pre-shade the deck surface. It's going to be easiest to just paint the whole base black and then mask the sides, rather than paint the deck surface and mask that off, as I'm not too sure how well the anti-slip will respond to masking, and I don't want to find out. With the black painted, I'll move on to the pre-shading using 2 colors for additional tonal variation to make the otherwise uniform gunship gray on the deck more visually interesting. Normally I freehand my pre-shading, but that's only because there's a lot of panels and I want to pre-shade within the panel lines, but for something large like this that's just one big panel, I break out my Masterpiece Models pre-shading stencils so I don't end up being uniform in my pre-shading, so I still have some random variation that way. With the first layer of pre-shading done in Gunship Gray, it's time to go back over it with Haze Gray to add some lighter areas to emulate the paint fading that often occurs on the decks of ships. The Mark 45 itself and the octagonal fairing that goes on the deck both get the same pre-shading technique as the base, but this time only using Haze Gray, and here is the result of that. I've gone over a few of the edges on the Mark 45 just to add some highlights there and make them really pop once the blend coat has been added. I've also pre-shaded the barrel, again, just to add some tonal variation and make the otherwise monotone gray scheme more visually interesting. That's kind of the whole point of pre-shading, just give it some tonal variation and break up the otherwise monotonous solid color. With the blend coat on everything done, the barrel and shell ejection cover can finally be glued in place. I usually leave small bits like this off when it's easier to paint them separately, rather than just trying to mask around them. This is another lesson that unfortunately took me way too many tries to learn and really commit to memory, but it's one of those that I've got down pat now. You'll notice that like when I did the technical, I pretty much did everything in sub-assemblies and left as little assembled as I could. That way I could very easily paint without having to do a lot of fuss when it came to masking. And finally, with everything assembled and painted, the weathering process can begin. Believe it or not, I usually don't use the dry brush technique, but I thought it would be perfect to highlight the anti-slip texture on the base and really add depth to the texture. I'm using AK Interactive's 3rd Gen acrylics in Dark Sea Gray to pick out the peaks of the texture here, and I'm also using a dedicated dry brush from MK by MIG, but any old brush with short, relatively stiff bristles will work to dry brush. It's as simple as loading up the brush with paint, drying it off, and then rubbing it over the surface to transfer the color of the brush on the high spots. Once this is fully dried, I'll apply a blue-gray panel line wash from MK by MIG to further darken the low spots of the anti-slip texture, and I'll also use it on a handful of rivets and panel lines throughout the model. If you've never used a wash before, it's a great way to highlight crevices and emulate dirt and grime buildup in the small spots. Generally speaking, I'll try to apply as little as possible, as it makes the cleanup process much easier when you've only got a little to do. Because a wash is essentially very thin paint, I'll just tap the brush where I need the wash to be and let capillary action drag it into the crevice. Once the wash has dried for about 5 to 10ish minutes, or whenever it looks matte, I'll go back with a wide, flat brush that's just damp with white spirits and clean up the excess. I find it's easiest to do this by dragging the brush across the surface and trying to not let it dip into the crevice. There is a sweet spot where you can easily remove the wash and you won't stain the surface, but I usually end up doing my cleanup earlier rather than later to avoid staining the surface just to be safe. It's much easier to go back and add more of the wash rather than trying to blend the stain or having to repaint the area, and here's how the wash turned out on the MK-45, along with the combination of the wash and dry brushing on the base. With the wash complete, we can move on to the rest of the weathering process, trying to emulate the various splotches of dirt that appear in the reference photos. Sometimes these MK-45s are kept pretty clean, but I always enjoy dirtying things up, so we'll splotches the reference photos of the 2 dirty ones to guide us on where to put the splotches. I've added a splotch of medium gray oil paint here, and we'll add a darker splotch using some Starship based sludge. I'll add some of the oil paint to a little well and grab some polyurethane foam cut into a little sponge and my tweezers to apply it to the desired area. I'll always check the pattern on the sponge out on my thumbnail or a paper towel after loading the sponge up. That way I make sure I won't end up putting too much oil on the model. Just press the sponge onto the surface of the model where you want the color to go, and that's really it. This technique is pretty much that simple. Using a sponge here adds some random variation to help the effect better imitate life, because life is random. We can vary how much white spirit is on the brush when we go to blend it. That way we really change how the effect is used. If you want the effect to be more pronounced and more like dirt or grime buildup, use less white spirit, it'll blend it out less. If you want it to act more like a filter, just use more white spirit. For this, I'm using a number 6 half round brush as I want the short stiff bristles combined with less white spirit to imitate a splotch of grime. The nice thing about using oils is that you have a long working time and can completely remove the effect if you're unhappy with it. Just be sure to let it sit for a few days to dry before adding another layer if you don't want the 2 layers to mix. I usually let it sit for about 2 days and I find that works well. If you want the effect to be a little bit lighter, wet the area with some white spirits prior to sponging the oil paint on. This will help the effect spread out on the surface and be less concentrated. With oils, you can also blend colors right on the surface, and to get that brownish color from one of the earlier reference photos, I'll mix earth and dust on the surface of the model directly, applied using the same sponge technique, and then blended into the surface using the same method as I would use for a single color. And here's the result of the finished splotches. While these are drying, I'll shift my focus to applying oils to the base, particularly around the electrical boxes in the rear, based on these references. To do this, I'll grab my rust-colored oil paint and apply it directly to the areas where rust has accumulated using a fine 000 brush. I'll turn this into a wash directly on the surface of the model, as I think the tide lines this effect creates best suits the wet environment that created the rust, rather than mixing up a wash and applying it to the model. To do this, I'll use the same 000 brush used to apply the oil paint to blend it into the surface using quite a lot of white spirit, pushing the paint where I want it to go. I'll also add some rust streaks on the large electrical box, creating a starting point for the streak using the oil paint and then dragging it out using some white spirits, mostly from the edge of that starting point in the direction I want the streak to go. This is probably my favorite way to make individual streaks, as you have a lot of control in the size and opacity of the streak, allowing you to make a large wide streak or a very fine scratch that's now rusted. With the streaks on the base done, I'll add some black pigment to the end of the barrel from this Doc O'Brien's pigment set from Micromark that I've had for several years now. I'll apply the pigments using both a small disposable brush along with a very short stiff bristled brush for pigment application from Ammo by MiG, rubbing the pigments onto the surface in both instances until I'm happy with the application. And then for the finishing touches, now that the splotches I added earlier are completely dry and I don't need to worry about the splotch blending into the streak, I'll add just a few streaks of Starship-based sludge on the body of the MK-45 using the same technique I used for the rust streaks. And just like that, this Mojo booster build is finally complete. I hope you enjoyed watching the process as much as I enjoyed building something different and without the pressure to have it look good. It was a much needed refresh on my workbench, and it really did its job in bringing my Mojo back. Don't forget to subscribe, that way you don't miss out on any other antics that result in me needing more Mojo builds like this. I think I'll have to finally pick up RPG model CWiz after enjoying this Mark 45 so much. Enjoy some photos of the finished build, and I'll see you in the next one.